Welcome, Sheila. It is my huge pleasure to be in conversation with you today on behalf of Systemic Lives, which is an offshoot of Murmurations, the Journal of Transformative Systemic Practice, which you know, I imagine you're kind of aware of and have had some readings of. And it's a really great opportunity to hear a bit more about yourself. There's something about the interweaving between the personal and the professional, and how those different contexts kind of affect and influence each other. Mm-hmm. So I was very curious because my name is Sheila, and it's a Bengali name, but without an E, and your name is Sheila. And I wondered how you got your name. Who gave it to you?
Yeah, that's a great question because I'm from a large family of there's 6 siblings, and I'm the only one that my father named, and he selected the name Sheila. I don't really know why, and I don't know why he named me, and my mother had the naming rights of the other 5. I have no idea. And they aren't alive, so I can't ask them now. But I know that growing up, I was told repeatedly that Sheila is, Gaelic for Cecilia, or Cecilia is Gaelic for Sheila, one or the other, and that also there's a connection to the name Julia, and that there was an aunt or a great aunt who was Cecilia. And I actually still have one of those old-fashioned handheld mirrors that's silver, silver encased and all elaborate and so forth.
Lovely.
And that evidently was Cecilia's, so that's the legacy. But that's all I know about how that name came about. Yeah.
Sort of different kind of connotations, the Gaelic connotations. And different kind of constructions, which is kind of quite interesting, isn't it? About
Yeah.
sort of your later kind of leaning towards constructions and the
Yeah.
idea of the mirror, the silver mirror, very interesting about reflections and what gets reflected back. So
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
and so you were one of 6 siblings,
Mm-hmm.
and I wondered sort of what kind of an era or a time that you were born into, and what was happening in your family. Where were you in the 6?
Mm-hmm. I was the 4th. I am the 4th. And the first 4 of us were pretty close together, a year and a half, and then maybe 2 years, and then another year and a half. And then there was a big spread of 5 years, and the next 2 pretty close in succession. So I was born in the mid 50s, in 1954. And yeah, so, watching my older siblings, particularly my oldest sibling, go through high school, and the Beatles and all of that kind of stuff, like having older siblings. Of course, I was young, but I was also able to be part of that whole movement. And then, of course, in the 70s, when I was already in college myself and so forth, very much part of the countercultural stuff in the 70s and all of that. So yeah.
Sounds really a very kind of energizing kind of environment, with lots of things going on with different siblings. And I was just thinking, um, it, if you were to kind of give a little bit of a flavor for people, what would have been sort of a typical day in your household, as you were growing up?
Well, there's one that sticks with me that I find myself telling people a lot of late, and that is a day in the life in the summertime, because that, of course, is when my mother, as a a homemaker and a mother, was strapped with six children who aren't in school and so forth. And so my mother was an artist of multiple forms. So she, you know, uh, played the piano and sang. She performed in plays and in musicals. She painted. She painted scenery for a lot of the plays and musicals that she was in,
Mhm.
designed and painted it. And then she also had a little business where she would customize. I mean, actually, it's kind of interesting because I feel it parallels the work that we do. She would interview people, say a couple or a family who wanted to have a sign to hang outside their home or
Right.
on a post at the end of their drive or something like that. And she would interview them so that she could kind of make a contemporary modern day coat of arms that was particular to that family and their interests and their activities. So she did all of that. So in the summer, we had a very rigorous schedule of swimming lessons in the morning, and then we would have to walk home 2 miles from the town pool, and we'd have lunch, and then we would have 3 hours of what my mother called quiet time. And in that quiet time, we could do any of the following: read a book, write a story, make some art, or take a nap. And so we all six of us actually were kind of channeled into making art,
Mhm.
and as then left it. And then as we get older, my oldest sister, who's a retired professor as well, she has just been making beautiful paintings and selling them and winning awards in art shows and so forth. And so, yeah, that was sort of a day in the life. And the other aspect of that, my mother being was kind of a bohemian, and so the house was always kind of chaotic, as you would anticipate in that kind of a household. Ordered chaos in a way.
Yeah, yes. Lots kind of going on and something very creative in different forms that you were talking about that sort of really was a part of your backdrop
Yeah.
of your life for a long time. And you were talking about your mother, sort of her creativity. I'm sort of wondering also about your father and what a role he might have been playing as well, and what was the kind of exposure that you might have got from him.
Yeah, they were complete opposites. He was happy to be home and reading a book. He was very kind of literary, not particularly social. I'd say he was, what's the word? I think he was a little intimidated by the world, actually. He was, his training was in chemistry, and he worked for a big chemical company that, he would go on the road and sell the chemicals to huge, shampoo companies and oil companies and things like that. So he was strict, she was loose. They were complete opposites. It was a kind of schizophrenic family, I guess, in that way.
But also kind of again sort of very diverse in kind of in terms of what they were kind of giving you. And I was wondering, what do you think you took from those different kind of influences? What kind of stayed with you in your adolescence and in your sort of maybe your early adulthood from those experiences in your early childhood?
Hmm. Good question. I guess, from my mother, I I should add that when I was in high school, I was incredibly embarrassed by my mother because she was such a bohemian, walking around in blue jeans in the 1960s and 70s as a mother in this, a middle class town. with paint splotches all over her pants and stuff. And that's not the way the other mothers were. But, but as I got older, of course, I really feel I owe to her that sort of, just go out and do it, and say what you think, and don't be afraid to just explore or be different. From my father, the other sort of tampering that a little bit, pay attention. Education was very important to him. And so, be serious, pay attention to what you're doing, be careful. So a little bit, like for as much as my mother's sort of free spirit, there is the sort of reining in a little bit from my father. So maybe that sort of balanced things out a bit. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. Really interesting in terms of another kind of theme about the free spiritedness of your mother. Also someone who sort of maybe a bit of a risk taker and sort of did something beyond, out of the usual. And as a woman as well of that time. So I was sort of think and your father, you were saying that he was sort of much more, although he had those kind of corporate life experiences working with very big organizations, he also liked to be at home. So I was just also thinking about the gender kind of messages
Yeah.
that you think
Yeah.
might have been there for you, and what did you take away from those kinds of
Yeah,
messages?
I hadn't actually thought about that, but I think as I hear you saying that, it is exactly the case that he was the more like, I want to be home. The world is a scary place. I need to be protected, and my mother. So it was like a complete reversal of gender roles, and I think that really affected me because I grew up like that when I was at university. I remember, with a lot of the feminist movement, I was perplexed a little bit about needing to kind of state things, because for me it was like, that's what a woman should do what a woman wants to do. And
Mhm.
I remember having not dismissing other people's need to talk about feminist issues or to articulate their feminist values, but also just feeling like, I don't feel I need to do that. I feel like you just are that. You live it. And yeah, but I had never really thought about the role reversal in my family. It was,
Mhm.
the things that are so obvious kind of pass you by often.
But
Yeah.
really interesting how you'd already been living in those kind of contexts, whereas going to university kind of somehow highlighted to you that people had very different kind of experiences, maybe much more normative kind of gender, whatever that meant, gendered kind of roles in and something about your parents as being really quite trailblazers in some ways. Would you, I don't know whether you'd think of them in that way, being really quite different in the 50s,
Hmm.
in those kind of reversals.
Yeah, I don't, I never, no, I wouldn't think of them as trailblazers. Of course, this retrospective narration, you could certainly see that. Um, I mean, there was a 7-year age difference between my parents, and so I think that there was a piece of it that also, my mother was, I think, 21 when she married, and so, so young. And so
Yes.
I think despite what I've just said about looking like this role reversal, there was also this, he's going to protect the family and make the money, and bring home the bread, so to speak.
Mhm.
And I know that he felt very burdened by that, with so many children. Um,
Mhm.
but I mean, but we were quite comfortable. But it was like always, he was a worrier. That's what he was. And
Mhm.
she was like you know,
It'll happen kind of thing,
yeah.
like you were saying, yes. But it's you were talking about the discomfort around that. You were saying that and of course for children the experience of their parents is very different, when it happens to that retrospective kind of thinking. Um, but can you say a little bit about how those discomforts was kind of shaping some of how you were thinking about yourself as you were kind of going into your adolescence and your early kind of adulthood?
Yeah. Um, I, my adolescence and early adulthood was very rebellious, uh, and mostly directed to my father. So I think, I picked up more, I was siding with my mother and resisting this kind of being put in a box. If I wanted to go to a party or have fun, my father would always give a comment about that, I should study harder. I mean, it was always this contrast and trying to, keep me within limits. And I really resisted that. And I did some not pleasant things. I would fight back to my father a lot, and no one else did in the family. And so, well, my older brother did a bit too. So we were like the two rebels in the family. The others just kind of ignored and, didn't have to fight back. They just didn't follow what he wanted. And so I think that thinking about it now, my parents, the way they were, I see how I, I can't say I chose to take my mother's route because I'm not completely like her, but that I, I developed this ability to rebel against the status quo.
Mhm.
And I would say that that's still something that's it's been part of me forever, and it creates a lot of problems. It has in my professional life. I have colleagues who are great systemic therapists who say you're just a lightning rod because you say what you think. And and so I've learned as I get older to be a little bit more careful and not tread on other people so much. But I can be pretty outspoken about when I think something is not just or
Mhm.
right.
Mm. And of course, those kind of aspects of you, the 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 rebellious one, the one who's kind of questioning givens and kind of uh agitating things, that are kind of attempts to rein things in. They've been part of your professional development and your thinking. Um, and it's very interesting to kind of think about those connections, and I'm sure we'll come to that in a bit. But I just I was sort of thinking about your that other side of you as well, the one that was also into learning and writing, and just wanting to kind of hear a little bit about your experience at university and what did that sort of, what did that bring up for you? How did it kind of uh yeah, what are the ways in which it influenced you?
Yeah. So that's a story. um, I when I graduated high school and was applying to universities and colleges, my father really wanted me to go to this very small liberal arts school, a Catholic school in Vermont. And that school is where my older brother went to school. It was all male, an all male school. And he graduated in May, and I started in September, the first year they took female students. So there were 100 females and 2,000 men, males. And my older brother had told his friends who weren't graduating, take care of my little sister. So I arrive on campus, and immediately all these upperclassmen are, taking care of me, taking me, to, a poetry reading or this or that, which was pretty heady, for a first year student, to be rubbing elbows with the last year students, and so forth. Anyway, I was a philosophy major there, and I was there for 2 years, and this is goes back to my father continually. My grades were very good, and but he was always putting pressure on me. And after my second year, I wanted to stay living in Vermont and not go home. We lived in northern New Jersey for the summer, and my father said, "If you don't come home, I'm not paying any more for your education." So I said, "Okay, don't." I- And he kind of panicked. And so then he said, "Okay, I will pay for you to go to a secretarial school, a crash course, 12-week course for college women," because I had had 2 years. Yeah. So I did this where I learned how to take shorthand, how to type really fast, how to do all the office things you're supposed to do. It's ridiculous anyway. But it was a great group of about 10 other women who were really smart women who were just doing this so they could get a job after they graduated from college. So then for 2 years, I worked as a secretary, but always,
Sorry. I'm so sorry.
that's okay. I worked as a secretary for 2 years, always in a university context. I worked at the University of Vermont in the Department of Family Relations and Human Development. So that, is kind of interesting. And then I worked at Harvard Business School for one of the deans. And there's stories to be told about that. I mean, I was hired as a secretary, but then they had me doing research because, they thought I could do more than secretarial work, which was, of course, very gratifying for me. But after, somewhere between the first and second year, I said, "Okay, enough of this. I'm going to go back to school." And then I returned to school on my own dime. And and so I was really independent. And then at that point, my father would start sending me checks, and I would rip them up. And so that was sort of always my rebelliousness. Like, no, if you're paying, then you can tell me what to do, and I'm going to do what I want to do. So I don't need you to pay. So that kind of, cut the path for me. And when I returned to school, instead of going into philosophy again, where I had started, I decided I wanted to study communication for all the wrong reasons. I thought communication would allow me to kind of integrate my artistic. I had also minored in art, and growing up, as I told you, so the artistic and the communication would allow me to go into advertising or public relations, something like that. Okay, so I arrive, and I have funding to help me, and I have to work for it. So I said, "Well, I'd like to work in the department." And so they sent me over to the head secretary, and she said, "Oh, you have great typing skills. I could use you as a typist." And I said, "Don't you have any research assistant positions that I could take?" And she looked at me, I remember, as if I had 10 heads, like, "You want to do research?" So she sent me to Barnett Pierce. And and boy, did I luck out, because having had 2 years already as a philosophy major and being really focused in that way, and then having this crazy idea that I wanted to go into advertising, but meeting up with Barnett, of course, his approach to communication very philosophical. So it was just such a resonance and such a perfect fit. And so then the rest is history, basically. You know, I did go away to another PhD program after I finished my undergraduate, but I did it mostly to prove to myself that I could do it. It was a very positivist program. And I needed to prove to myself that I was choosing this more relational approach, not because it was easier, but because it was right for me. I felt it was right. And it wasn't that I couldn't do a good old social science number crunching kind of degree. So I did it for a semester and then I returned to the University of Massachusetts with Barnett, Pierce, and Byrne Cronin and finished
Wow.
my.
What a what a kind of path, sort of going from that sort of sense of going from home to this environment where you are the first cohort of women, young women, to go into an all male school or college, as we might say here.
Yeah.
And to have 2 years of that, again, sort of being very pioneering, very sort of uh maybe hallowed ground, sort of spaces where one was not permitted to go into, for a long time. And then something about how that trajectory was kind of, in a way, interrupted with the lack of funding from your father, but wanting you to go into a different path of sort of typing, which was sort of seen as something that was so much more female
Exactly.
oriented, wasn't it, than the academia. Um, and then just through those fortuitous kind of routes, you go into the Department of Family Studies as well, and then somehow find yourself, through to but and Cronin Pierce. I mean, and that's pretty amazing. All of those kind of how they kind of come together. And that theme that you're talking about, how important it was to do this for yourself and in your own terms. And I sort of wondered about that determination, to kind of do things independently, particularly, you're talking about your father, but something I wondered where that came from and sort of what gave you courage to really push through.
So I want to be careful to not demonize my father. However, I grew up with him calling me a social butterfly and a dumb blonde. And, teasing, but if I would get upset, he would say, "Oh, can't you take a joke, or something like that." At the same time, he was always my oldest sister was a merit scholar, and great A's all her life, and um, he would tell me that I was smarter than her, and that my IQ, all the and so and he had a hard time dealing with her when he didn't like what she was doing. He would ask me to go and talk with her, like sort of the parentified child in those contexts. So there was like these multiple, like, parentified child, the dumb blonde, social butterfly, and I think that latter part, the dumb blonde social butterfly, really pushed me to basically prove, no, I'm not that. I used to say when he would say, you're smarter than your sister, I would say, yeah, but she doesn't have a social life, and I have a social life, and I can also be smart. And um, so
In that uber confident kind of way.
yeah, yeah, and not that I was uber confident, but just acting that way and trying to kind of say, don't put me down because relationships and my social life are is important to me. Don't don't dismiss me because of that. I can do both, and so I think really there was this attempt to kind of disprove that narrative that he had of me,
Mhm.
But I know it's not the only narrative he had of me because he also had, I was the peacemaker in the family, et cetera, et cetera. But um, yeah.
Yeah, lots of different qualities that you seem to that your parents picked up on about you, and you were also trying to connect with those different kind of qualities about yourself. You were talking about that person who's kind of interested in fostering and making relationships, like those 10 women that you were in that course with around the typing, but uh also someone who was thinking about something very different for her path in terms of thinking about research
Hmm.
as well, and uh, maybe academia, as you were talking about your father also, where there's a huge emphasis on education for him. So, there's something about that that you also carried, as well as the more creative side. And you were talking a little bit about that, but it almost felt like it was a subdued, maybe, aspect of you. But I didn't want to make that assumption about the more creative, maybe the more artistic sort of side of you. And I wondered where that sort of went and how that
Mm.
got expressed as you went along.
Oh, that's a good question. I think I really tampered that down a lot. I think in my early 20s, I basically stopped doing any art, and I had seriously considered studying art at university, for a while. So I just stopped, and occasionally, like I would draw a card for someone, but that would be the extent of it. So I think the creativity I kind of channeled into my academic work. And I mean, my husband and I are colleagues. We met in graduate school. Barnett Pierce fixed us up together for our first date. And we for years would have the students who are graduating at the end of the year, we'd have them here to our house for a party, and the students would go through the house and say, who plays the guitar? Oh, Jack plays the guitar. Who does this? Oh, Jack does that. Oh, Jack does that. Oh, Jack does that. And then they'd say, well, what are your hobbies, Sheila? And I'd say, work. My work is my hobby. So I think I kind of channeled everything into my work, but it's not like work. It's what I live and breathe, and the creativity. I'm not going to make the claim that my work is creative, but I think the approach I take is to look at something that is taken for granted and basically try to turn it around into something else. And and that would be, I think, a common theme in my academic work. And so that's what I do. And in fact, I retired 2.5 years ago, and I have friends and family members who literally become angry with me if they ask me to do something and I say, oh, I can't, I have, a Zoom meeting. They'll say, I thought you were retired. And, I know a lot of people when they retire do leave behind what they've been doing and start, painting or bicycling or running marathons or just doing different things. But, like it's not like you just turn it off. This is who I am and what I do, and I don't see it as work. I see it as the joy of what I enjoy doing. So I guess that's where the creativity tries to go.
Yes, yes, sort of that connection between sort of what's kind of given and then how you kind of shape it up and redo it in a different kind of a um almost like with different colors, different words, different kinds of, yeah, like you
Mm,
were saying about shaking things up. So that sort of combination of the artistic and the academic side of you sort of just coming together in your work, and sort of keeping those aspects of your father and your mother in you. It's I wonder what you think about that sort of those aspects of your parents kind of coming together and sort of being fluid in you through what you do.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do think so. I'll tell you a funny story about, I don't know, maybe 6 years ago, maybe it was more. My husband's always trying to get me, like other people, to do something than sit at my desk and write or, whatever. And so, there have been lots of gifts, like a gift of voice lessons, a gift of dance lessons, and this. And several years ago, he gave me painting lessons, and the painting class was called Painting into Abstraction. Now, I would go every week to this class, and my paintings were so realist. I just couldn't, as the social constructionist, I couldn't just do this abstract thing. I was like very realist. Finally, by the end of that class, they all applauded me. Finally, you've done something abstract. But I see that as sort of a metaphor, if you will, of sort of that coming together. Like, in my work, the creativity of my mother, that artistic part is there, but there's also still this kind of, I wouldn't say I follow all the rules of academia, but I know how far I can go, and still be able to get something published, for example. I mean, you can't just, I mean, you can take big risks, and some people have, but yeah, so I think that that's the father part of me, kind of
Sort of
keeping,
working within the kind of parameters in some ways.
yeah, yeah,
And it's interesting because I think you put together a book which was design thinking and social thinking, which is an interesting title about the more abstract, graphic, sort of artistic, and then the sort of um the the more maybe academic thinking and
yeah.
pulling that together. I mean, you know, before we talk a little bit more about maybe your professional kind of joys, and we've started to do that a bit. You're talking about how it's so much a part of you. I was just sort of thinking and sort of very curious about what some of your sort of heroes, sheroes might have been during the time that you were sort of a young adult. You know, what kind of books might you have read? What kind of music might you have listened to? What what were some of your kind of defining cultural influences?
So are you talking before university, basically, growing
Yeah,
up?
university maybe as well, sort of, but yeah, growing up, but also university that you think might have endured over time for you or changed actually.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of my deep, deep loves as a teenager was 18th century Russian literature. And I was just, I loved reading that stuff. And actually, reading things like The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky is really what made me want to study philosophy. I mean, it was sort of, there's religious or theological overtones there, but for some reason, I was just fascinated with that in a very, it was completely unlike any of my friendship group. Um, I didn't have a lot of tolerance for, this is probably part of my father too, a lot of tolerance for just hanging around, which a lot of my friends did, just hang around. And I remember, in my late teens feeling kind of like, do I fit here? And I wasn't disturbed by it, but I just knew that I was not, I was bored, by what was happening. So the music issue was like I was listening to the music everyone else was listening to, that was the popular rock music of the time. And trying to think of what, I mean, it's so hard so many years ago to think what other sorts of things really were part of my life besides the academic stuff. Um, I, I, I'll have to think.
I mean, I think it's very interesting what you're saying about your love of reading and books, and particularly Russian kind of literature, and thinking about that context, and it sort of connected for me with what you were saying earlier about wanting to stay in Vermont as opposed to going back home. And just I wondered what it was about these different contexts that really drew your imagination, and what how was it kind of, influencing you? What was it sort of giving you that was different from what might have been familiar, hanging around, being at home?
Yeah, that raises a lot of stuff for me because I have to admit that I kind of bought the narrative that my father was selling me, that I was that I wasn't adventurous, that I needed to rely on my social friends. I couldn't be apart from them. I couldn't leave the safe enclave. I mean, that was part of his whole thing about me being a social butterfly, that it was my social life was way too important to me, and that without it, I would just crumble. So kind of I thought, yeah, that's true. And yet I remember thinking this in 1986 when I was a visiting professor in Italy, and thinking back and saying, how did this person who needs that kind of contained, secure environment do come to live by yourself? I'd never lived on my own in my entire life until that moment, and there I was in a foreign country, and then then I started retrospectively, like going, being in Vermont, and then being totally fed up with being in Vermont, and just up and moving to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and getting a new job, and then just up and moving to Western Massachusetts to go back to school. And I started seeing this, like, wow, I don't think of myself as this really independent person at all. I think of myself as this, in some ways, needy, I need support and so forth. And so, yeah, I don't know, like maybe it was just my need to prove that I didn't, you know, I wasn't that parochial kind of person.
Sort of, but by moving around quite a lot, and sort of whether it was in books, kind of going and entering into different contexts, but also kind of moving around. And you were talking about uh your kind of experience of going to different places, and I was thinking, at what point did you come into systemic psychotherapy, into family therapy, into clinical work? How did that come about?
Yeah. Um, I remember that distinctly. I was in graduate school, and I think it was my very first semester, and I went to the bookstore. I was interested in family communication
Mhm.
because, and I for years, decades, I taught a course called Family Communication, and I would always start it by saying, I want you to know why this course is interesting to me. And it's because my family was kind of, hard to understand, like every family. And so, I'm just drawn to trying to understand these dynamics. And so I went to I had this slew of courses that I was taking. I went to the university textbook annex, to buy my textbooks. And of course, so I would always go to other courses that had titles that intrigued me. And there was a family therapy course with all the books lined up. And there was Paradox and Counter Paradox. And I bought it. And I read it, and then I showed it to Vern Cronin. I said, Vern, you've got to see this book. This is really interesting. And so that then took me, beyond just studying family communication to being interested in family therapy. And as a graduate student, I took the family therapy courses. I sat with seeing families, but I was always behind the mirror. And there were two parallel programs at that time. So Vernon Barnett started becoming interested in and connected with the family therapy world. I was, doing stuff and connected. And so there was a family therapy program in the School of Education, and then communication had we had some connection. There was another student in the family therapy program who he and I became friendly. Sergio Parata is his name, and we were basically writing parallel dissertations. They were very much the same. Mine was integrating family therapy with the coordinated management of meaning theory,
Right. Mhm.
and Sergio was doing something using the CMM theory, but it was similar. And we talked back and forth and back and forth. And then I finished my PhD and I came here to New Hampshire as an assistant professor. And Sergio called me up and he said, I'm doing this training program in systemic family therapy, and I know that you really want to be on the other side of the mirror. So I'm going to give you a scholarship to come to this training program.
Wow.
So I couldn't. I said, yeah, you've called my bluff. You know what I want. So for a couple of years, I did the training. It was in the evenings, 1 day a week, and that was the beginning of it. And then through that, other connections, he asked me to give a workshop on the connection between the coordinated management of meaning theory and Milan systemic family therapy, because that's what my dissertation was about. And then people came to that workshop, and then they asked me, to give workshops, and slowly that happened. Also, Sergio is responsible for all my connections in Europe, I have to say, because it started with he came home. He is an Italian citizen, but grew up in the U.S. His father was a professor at Harvard, but Italian, and so he had taken a sabbatical and gone to live in Italy for a year, and he spent a lot of time at the Milan Center. And while he was at the Milan Center, of course, this was probably in 83 or something like that, maybe 82. He, no, must have been later, like 84. He met Laura Frigeri, and he came back and he said, Sheila, you and Laura need to meet each other, and you need to do this research project together. Like, she's got an idea, and you have an idea, and I think you guys need to do that. And so I think we both said, okay. And then Carl Tom had an international conference, and we met there. And we arranged that Laura would fly home with me and stay here for a week, and we would talk about what we could do together. And we did. And then we embarked on this research project about burnout in social service providers, where we wanted to deconstruct this idea that this is an individual pathology, that people get burned out, and look at it more as a relational phenomenon, and reconstruct what burnout means, and give alternative understandings. So we are going to do this we did a cross-cultural US Italian social service providers. But that led to her inviting me as a visiting professor at the University of Parma. So I was there for several months teaching, but also so we could work on our research. We had collected our data, and then we were writing, analyzing, and so forth. And then the next year she came here to the University of New Hampshire as a visiting professor for a semester as well. So, I never would have met her. I never would have, when I was living in Italy, I spent a lot of time at the Milan Center. So Boscolo and Chikine and, a whole slew of other people became really close friends and colleagues. And, from there, just, I don't know, it all sort of blossoms.
They're very, very exciting kind of times where relationships and those connections,
Yeah.
something that you'd been so good at, in terms of making relationships, but how they were really coming together and coalescing with your professional kind of uh interests and kind of projects. And I was just sort of thinking, are you okay? Did it
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Um, I was wondering about there's a lot of history that was being made when you were talking about those times,
Oh, yeah.
and you were talking about um Bosco and Keane, Lara Gary, Carl Tom, and I'm sure there would have been so many more around that time. And I was just wondering, what were some of your joyful moments, with different people that you were in these kind of partnerships with,
Mm.
that was making history.
It they were heady days. I mean, they did at the time it was just fun and great, but looking back, I think so much was happening in those days. I mean, there's just so much excitement and revolutionary stuff happening, and everybody was involved. And I just there was a lot of playfulness. There was also a lot of in those days there was a great deal of integration of literature, so it wasn't just as there wasn't just family therapy. There was all the cybernetics stuff, and then the new paradigm and ways of making ways of looking at how we do science, and all these ideas were kind of percolating and being integrated. And it was it was like a big experimental period that was very welcoming. Like there wasn't that sort of competition of whose ideas are better. I do feel like over the decades, there's evolved this, which form of therapy is better, not everybody's like that, but there is a big sense of, even some people have this discussion, is narrative therapy a form of social construction? It's like, you know, why do we have to like own something? Like this is my brand, and do you follow my brand or not? I think is unfortunate, but that does happen. But in those days, I didn't feel that at all. Maybe I was naive to it. Maybe it was there. I don't know, but it was just such an open and curious time. I mean, the ideas were so stimulating.
And and I cannot sort of imagine, because I started my training in the 90s, and so we knew about we were students at that time, and we occupied a very different kind of world from people like yourselves who were kind of really coming together and cross fertilizing these kind of ideas in this very creative kind of way, like a canvas, on a maybe on a in a
Yeah.
painting, lots of different ways, and it was coming together. But um and we were aware that people were visiting each other from different kind of countries, and different ideas coming together. I trained at the Tavistock, so
Mhm.
I heard about some of those kinds of connections that were coming together. And of course, they resulted in kind of books and articles and various developments there. And for you, what would have been maybe, it might be very difficult to kind of choose, but what would have been the works or the connections or the relationships that you felt most inspired by, or that sort of feels some creativity for you? What would you be able to choose or to say something about, to give a flavor of that for us?
Yeah, I think back in those days, like in the 80s and 90s, it was it, Gianfranco Cecchine was just really um, he was a great mentor and a, a great inspiration because he was such a smart guy. He could just turn something in such a light way. He was playful but not disrespectful at all. And that ability, that I learned a lot from him in that way, to be, you don't have to disagree with someone, and you don't have to uh, disrespect them, but you can take what they're giving you and kind of move it around in a playful way. And I think I was just doing a consultation with somebody about this difficult family issue 2 days ago, and I was trying to make this point about, if he could, there are two ways to start a conversation with his sibling. One is would be very serious, which would not go well, and the other would be to invite her into, like, can we just try this out and see how this kind of conversation would go? And I think for him it was a brand new idea, but that's the sort of thing I learned from Gianfranco Cecchine, is that playfulness is a real invitation to people. And then Peter Lang, he definitely picked up Cecchine's playfulness. He was always able to play like that, with ideas. And I had the good fortune of doing a lot with KCC in it must have been in the early 2000s. I was there as an examiner a couple times a year for several years and doing workshops and stuff like that. So, Peter was always, and I met Peter back in the 80s at one of Carl Tom's conferences. So that was also an old relationship that, Carl's another person, because I did my PhD research up in Calgary in Carl's program, interviewing families and family therapists about the therapeutic process. And Carl has been, he's another person. I think I wouldn't be where I am I know I wouldn't be where I am today if it weren't for Carl. He was and continues to be such an inspiration, and such a wonderful friend, yeah, and person.
Yeah, so these relationships have been really forged over a long time. And as
Yeah.
I was very struck by, as you were talking about the people who've really inspired you, Carl Tom, Jaquine, and also Peter Lang, and thinking about them as being men. And I sort of wondered about any, I know you spoke earlier about your collaborations with Laura Fugeri,
Mhm.
but I wondered, what did you think about yourself as a female who was also maybe kind of a pioneer and a contributing to maybe other people's inspirations? So where were you and other women sort of family therapists at that time?
Well, I never thought of myself as, in that kind of mentor or inspiring other people position. I, continue to think of myself as kind of the student, with these other people. But um, but there are lots of women, like Lynn Hoffman was, she was a good friend, and also very inspiring. And she and I actually tried to do a book together that it didn't happen, which is too bad, because it would have been lovely to do that with her. But she was a big inspiration. And Peggy Penn, who, she was really a close person, and also, her work about writing and using writing in therapy and dealing with people who had experienced trauma, a lot of sexual trauma, was so sensitive and so warm and transformative. So those are two people who come immediately to mind who were really important women for me. Um, and then there are others, Imelda, Laura. I mean, more. I mean, as friends and colleagues, but also as just inspiration. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of interesting when sometimes as a course lead now, when we're talking about, trainees and who they kind of connect with and who do they kind of look up to. It's really interesting because it's mostly the male kind of proponents of family therapy, and
Yeah.
of course white as well. So
Yeah.
I was also very interested about what did you see about thinking around culture and race around your time. What was some of the thinking about that during that kind of really creative space? Where were those kind of thinkings, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it is really interesting because I think that the people who always got the most recognition were white males,
Mhm.
um, and mostly Western white males. Um, but there are a lot of non-white males who I think are exemplary illustrations. And I don't know how well known they are, and that's in and of itself another issue. But Ken Hardy, I don't know if you know his work, but his work is, I think, really important, and he's such an interesting and nice person, and so I really like his work. And then it was later when I got to know the Just Therapy group,
Mhm.
and I am really touched by their work and inspired by their work. But I didn't know of them until later.
Mhm.
Um, I think in the era, I mean, there were females, Virginia Satir, for example, uh, Janet Bavelis, they were there and definitely their work influenced me and I used it, but I never met them. And so maybe that's something like it's who you get to connect with face to face, then um, there's more. What they write about takes on a whole new meaning because you've met the person, you can talk to the person. But and then just locally here, people that you wouldn't know. But I think one of the best systemic therapists I know is one of my closest friends here, and I look up to her and lean on her all the time for her pearls of wisdom. So I think it's a unfortunate aspect that the era that I came up in really wasn't recognizing a lot of other cultures, women, other races, etc.
Mhm. Mm. Yeah, no, it's really interesting, sort of about that visibility and invisibility of what gets status and what gets kind of taken up and privileged and what doesn't, kind of thing. I
Yeah.
mean, but yet still, there's clearly a lot of really important and significant developments during your time. And I was sort of thinking about some of the kind of current thinking and development in the field. Um, I mean, I don't know whether it's a similar um, in the US, or in Europe, but certainly in this country, there's a real kind of movement, I guess, mostly since Black Lives Matters, a real kind of call to decolonize practice, therapy theory, and to think more about sort of, I guess, in a way, connecting back to some of your own thinking about contextual, things being more fluid, but also the kind of what is knowledge and who makes it knowledge, and what gets called up as being knowledge. And so yeah, I'm really curious to think, where do you think is some of the cutting edge kind of developments in family therapy now, and
Mm.
what are some of the developments that you're really curious about to see where it's going to go?
Yeah, good question. I've been thinking a lot over the past several years about do we need family therapy? Do we need therapy as we know it in the consultation room? And so the book that I just did with two of my Brazilian colleagues who are fantastic, practicing therapy as social construction. Really, I try to take that theme up. Like, it's not at the micro level in a family, in a couple, or for a person where the problems reside. The problems are really at this macro level of how we sustain and maintain practices that are unjust, or just arcane, to be able to see that not only are those imposed upon us, but that we maintain them, the more we don't critique and create alternatives. And so I think for the field of therapy writ large, we need a broader sense of community work rather than community work and work around what everybody's talking about now, fighting against neoliberal capitalist ways of living. And it has to start at a grassroots. I mean, it's you can't just go in and change a whole system overnight, but so it's hard work. But for example, Emerson Hazara, one of my co-authors on that book, practicing therapy as social construction, he he writes in the book about his work with the transgender population, and working, first being their therapist, but then shifting his role and encouraging them into community activism and working alongside them. And in the old school, that would be a no-no. Your role is you're the therapist. Don't violate that relationship by creating other kinds of relationships.
Mhm.
And they had great success. They were, being restricted in some of the services offered, and so that had been offered, and then they were taken away. And then they started this campaign and this activist movement, and things shifted. And so I think that's a powerful illustration. And I think for particularly for students training today to become family therapists, they have to have this. Politics isn't out of it. We have to take into consideration the way in which our institutions are very deeply a part of the problems that they see in their office, that people bring to them, that it's not just a mental health issue. And I really, really hope that that kind of training is happening. And my fear is that it's not happening enough, but I know it is happening in all the places where I know people. Yeah.
It, it's again, it sort of makes me think about that discourse, like you were saying, about trying to keep politics out of therapy, and or that, and versus some other thinking which is about how therapy is a political kind of act or act of social justice. So I I'm really interested to hear from you what a politically informed family therapy would look like in 5 years. Training, what would that look like? What would it need to include for you to kind of see it developing that way?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I do have two ideas about training. One is, and I've written a lot about this, that, what we do is people come in to a training program and immediately are introduced to a variety of theories and models and so forth. Or if it's a very specific training like systemic therapy, then they're introduced to that, maybe not the whole gambit. But what that does is it ignores the relational resources that people actually bring themselves, and it kind of makes you think like, I can't be the way I am with my family, with my friends. I have to be in this professional mode and do it this way. So I think what a training program should start with is putting, for example, it's just an idea, putting trainees into triads, but the triads mix every meeting, right? And in the triad, there's someone who interviews, someone who is interviewed with a current challenge or issue or something they want to talk about, and an observer. And after the interview, they share notes about what felt good when asked, did that how did was that question or that topic, and what did the observer notice, and what did how did the interviewer feel and about asking this or talking about that, and how did it just, and basically starting to keep an inventory of the ways that they talk with each other before learning any theories. And so if you do that for 6 months or a year, and you have kind of an inventory, if you will, of these are really familiar resources that I use, and they tend to be generative and useful, but they aren't in this kind of context, or I noticed they aren't, and then if I do this, so you become more aware of what you bring to the table. And then you learn about theories and methods and models and techniques and all of that kind of stuff. So that's one piece. But to your question of, being more politically aware and more aware of social justice, I think what training needs to be very clear about is the inseparability of the micro and the macro. And, I've spent a lot of time writing and talking about that we treat these macro level discourses as if they're truth, manna from heaven, like this is just the way it is. And we never stop to say, well, where did that come from? It came from people interacting at the micro level. And over time, a series of repeated coordinated activities create this kind of belief system. And then you treat it as the truth, and you take it for granted, and you start applying it everywhere. Okay. So if we change the way we operate at the micro level, we can change the macro level. And I think that that's really important lesson, because if you think about how do I change institutions, how do I change the way a culture governs, it's impossible. I mean, you feel impotent. How can you as one person or even as a group do something, make such a big change? But if we realize that, so the example I give is, if we take like the dominant discourse of medicine, and when you don't feel well, you go to the doctor or, a medical professional. If nobody ever again went to a medical professional, the dominant discourse of medicine would disappear. It would just disappear. Now that's never going to happen, but
Mm.
it to show the same, with education, like all children should be educated. It's required by law. If parents stop sending their children to school, that discourse would go away. So we are the ones that keep it alive, and I think that that's what trainees need to understand. And once understanding that inseparability of the micro and the macro, then you automatically are thinking about issues of social justice and fairness and equality and all those other issues.
As as I was listening to you, I was sort of thinking, is it almost sort of saying that the micro level is also about something that an individual can do? You know, is there something, whereas I think you were saying earlier about the importance of community to also to kind of bring about change. And I was thinking about power. I guess different people will feel empowered and or disempowered in different ways according to the different contexts that they've lived in and what they've experienced in terms of privilege and marginalization. Um, and so, um, yeah, I'm just wondering what what would make you hopeful? What sort of would give you some hope about how these very dominant power discourses are kind of there that may be more difficult to kind of dislodge? What is there anything from the work that you've done and or where you are that gives you a bit more hope about how some of these things might start to be loosened a little bit more?
I think, for me, a absolute sort of centerpiece for systemic work, for the work that we do, is this notion of reflexivity. So when you encounter this kind of knee-jerk reaction to, say, someone who maybe isn't as privileged, and what, instead of diagnosing them as depressed, let's say, to be able to engage in this kind of self-reflexive inquiry about how am I contributing once I diagnose this person as depressed, and then this person has is given a medication, antidepressant. How much am I contributing to the numbing of that person to the injustices that he or she experiences, and thereby continuing to let those injustices persist. And so what would the alternative be? The alternative might be a conversation with a client like this about that sort of thing. Like, would you, I could say you are depressed, but I could also say that you are responding in a completely natural way to a system that is oppressing you. And, then take up that conversation in therapy as a form of empowerment rather than the standard, oh, I'm helping you by giving you this medication and making you numb to all the injustices that you already know you experience. So, yeah.
Mm. So sort of really taking a different kind of approach, which kind of connects with the sort of the context that they're in and the kind of disempowerment, empowerment that they might be experiencing. You I was just sort of thinking about the time because I know I've taken up a lot of your time and you've been very generous. And as I was speaking, as we were speaking, I was sort of thinking about uh, one of Gail's question to Laura actually, and I thought I was going to I was going to ask you the same question like maybe half an hour ago, and I didn't. But just thinking about some of the earlier conversations that we had about starting with your family, And I guess I haven't asked you about your adult family, although you've mentioned your husband. And I was just sort of thinking about yeah, your adult family and sort of where is love here in Sheila McNamee's life and what does it look like? Apart
Mm.
from the amazing kind of work that you're doing and your connections with books and uh, continuing to learn and develop and also contribute your ideas to others. Yeah, where is Sheila McNamee now, post 2 years of retirement and love and family?
So my my love is my family, and I have a son who's almost 32, and his wife is pregnant. So in July, I will be a grandmother for the first time.
Oh, amazing.
So that's extremely exciting. Um, and again, like there's no barrier between my work and my family life. I used to joke when I was teaching still at the university and say, I'd be teaching social construction to students, and they're saying, "Oh, this is so hard. Why did I never hear about this before? Oh, I know why, because no young person could ever understand this." And I would say, "No, that's not true. My son is a social constructionist. He's my little experiment, But he he's grown up with these ideas, just living them, not necessarily, he would sit in occasionally if he didn't have school when he was quite young, he'd sit in on a seminar. And I'll never forget one day a student answered a question and my son sat back and said, "I don't think you really understand social construction."
He's he's had exposure to the best.
And the students were so intimidated by this little like 9-year old or 8-year old, whatever he was. But anyway, yeah. So I mean, I take great joy and give love and gain love from like writing, doing the academic work, but also sharing it with my family. My son's a writer, and I see how much of his writing is how much his whole life, the way he lives. He lives these ideas, and it yeah. So that's it. Just gives me great joy, and everyone who knows me well knows that I could talk to you for a week nonstop about my perfect son. So,
Well, it's a lovely note to kind of end on in some ways because I guess I started asking you questions about yourself and your experience of your parents and what you took from them and what you also made uniquely into you, that was you. And so I was just sort of final question really is what do you think your son has taken from you and his father and is kind
mm,
of making his own that he might
yeah,
go on to give to his child.
yeah. Our nuclear family is so different from my family, and we are the three of us very, very close, and can talk about anything, anything at all. And so I think what he has of his father's is a lot of creativity. My husband is, I mean, he's a colleague of mine, but he also is a musician, and my son is a very talented musician. And so they talk about that all the time. And my husband was also an alpine ski racer, and my son was an alpine ski racer. So they talk about that all the time. So they have these things that they do. What he has from me is not what his father he does things, like he just gets things done. My husband's a procrastinator. I'm not a procrastinator, and neither is my son. And he's very disciplined. He has a job that is about reading and writing, but he's doing his own writing. So he gets up in the morning and he does his own writing, and then he goes, to his work, and he makes time to do his music. And so I think, he's like a perfect amalgam of the two of us, is what I see. Yeah.
It's lovely. And in a kind of way, it's an interesting way about how that amalgam of the parents of you and your husband through your son is also a story that you told me about you and your parents, and it's amalgamating these different kind of strands of creativity, the sort of love of books and knowledge and writing, academia. There's something about how you really personify that, Sheila, um,
Mhm.
in a very kind of live, energizing kind of way, and continue to give us, great gifts as well through that kind of through that rich kind of exposure and thinking that you've that you've had for many, many years. Thank
Mm.
you.
Thank you, Sheila. I mean, I don't know that the story that we created here today would have been a story I would have told. I mean, questions bring forth answers, and so, you are a talented interviewer, I would say. I have really enjoyed talking with you, and if we did it again, there'd be a whole different story about me, I'm sure.
I'm sure, exactly. And I hope that we can continue talking. Thank you so much for your generosity as well, Sheila, and your spirit.